Christianity has a history problem, a big one, and it's hiding in plain sight. Because the moment you ask, where did this story actually come from, everything starts to fall apart. The timelines don't match, the eyewitnesses never show up, and the historical record everyone swears is ironclad. It's filled with holes big enough to swallow the entire religion. But here's the part most people never hear. The deeper you look into early Christianity, the less it looks like a divine revelation, and the more it looks like an invention. And once you see how the story was stitched together, you can't unsee it. Let's start where the cracks first appear, the missing decades. It starts with something most people never think about. Silence. Not poetic silence, not symbolic silence, but literal historical emptiness. Decades of it. If the central figure of a world religion really walked through marketplaces, healed crowds, challenged authorities, and shook an empire, the world should have noticed. Something should have been written. A report, a rumor, a complaint, anything. But the first Christian writings appear long after the supposed events. The earliest letters come around 20 years later, and even those mention almost nothing about a physical Jesus. No birthplace. No miracles. No parables. Just a vague spiritual figure who feels more like a concept than a man. Then more decades pass. Another 20. Another 30. Only after that silence do the gospel stories begin to appear. And these stories are not eyewitness accounts, but distant memories shaped by communities, not by observers. Imagine someone today claiming that a man performed public miracles in the 1,960 seconds. Imagine they said thousands saw him, that he fed entire crowds, that the sky went dark when he died. And imagine that not a single newspaper, diary, government record, or eyewitness from that era wrote a single word about it. You would not call that history. You would call it a legend. This is the first crack in the foundation. Not one big explosion of contradiction, just a long, strange quiet, a gap where history should be. And the more you look at that gap, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because silence is not neutral. Silence is a clue. Something happened in those missing decades. Something that shaped the story long before the story was written. And once you recognize that, you begin to wonder what else was added later. And what else was never there at all. The Gospels don't agree at all. Most people grow up believing the Gospels are four angles of the same story. Four perspectives that line up. Four witnesses simply remembering things a little differently. But the deeper you look, the more you realize something uncomfortable. These are not four versions of the same event. They are four different stories trying to sound like one. Take the birth of Jesus. One gospel places the Holy Family in Bethlehem because of a census. Another has them living in Nazareth and only briefly visiting Bethlehem. One says angels appear to shepherds. Another says astrologers follow a star. None of these details overlap, and they never get reconciled. And this pattern repeats everywhere. Jesus dies on different days depending on which gospel you read. In one story, he carries his own cross. In another, someone else carries it for him. Sometimes the women find an angel at the tomb. Sometimes two. Sometimes the tomb is open. Sometimes it is sealed and opened later. Each version builds its own rhythm, its own symbolism, its own meaning. But they do not line up the way real historical accounts do. If four people witnessed a crime, you would expect small disagreements. Maybe one forgets a detail. Maybe one misremembers a color. But you would not expect them to disagree on the timeline itself, or the main characters involved, or the sequence of events. When that happens, something is wrong with the story, not with the memory. And here's the strange part. None of the gospel authors ever claim to have seen Jesus with their own eyes. They are not saying I was there, or I heard him speak, or I followed him through the crowds. They write from a distance, gathering stories that already existed. Which brings up a difficult question. If the authors were not witnesses, and the stories do not match, then what exactly are we reading? The authors were anonymous. This is the part that shocks people the most. The Gospels were not written by the men whose names appear at the top. Matthew did not write Matthew. Mark did not write Mark. Luke did not write Luke. And the text called John was certainly not written by the disciple who supposedly leaned on Jesus during the Last Supper. These names were added long after the original manuscript circulated, almost like labels glued onto anonymous stories to make them feel trustworthy. And once you understand that, something becomes clear. You are not reading eyewitness reports. You are reading traditions shaped by communities. Entire groups retelling stories they believed, not stories they personally saw. Imagine discovering a book titled The Diary of Socrates and then learning it was written 2 centuries after Socrates died by someone who never met him, never met anyone who knew him, and lived in a completely different cultural world. Would you trust it as history or as a literary attempt to create authority? That is exactly what we are dealing with here. The earliest gospel manuscripts do not even contain author names. They begin with a story, not a signature. No introduction saying I was there, this is what I saw, or I traveled with Jesus through Galilee. Nothing. Just anonymous narrative. And anonymity matters. When a text has no clear author, no clear origin, and no stated reason for being written, it becomes impossible to verify. You cannot check the source. You cannot examine their bias. You cannot test their memory. All you have is a claim without a claimant. Which leaves us with a troubling reality. If the foundation texts of Christianity were written by unknown hands, then what we call Scripture is not eyewitness testimony. It is hearsay shaped into Scripture long after the events. And as unsettling as that is, it is not even the largest problem waiting underneath. The Jesus problem, history's quietest Messiah. This is where the silence becomes almost eerie. Outside of the Bible, Jesus barely exists, not metaphorically, literally. There are no letters written by him, no personal belongings, no physical descriptions from people who claim to follow him, no trial documents that would normally accompany a political execution, no Roman reports describing an unstable preacher stirring crowds in a tense province that Rome monitored closely. For someone portrayed as a public figure who healed the sick, fed multitudes, and drew crowds so large they filled hillsides, the historical footprint is almost invisible. What we do have are a few scattered mentions written decades after the fact, usually just a line or two, and none of them come from someone who saw Jesus with their own eyes. They are second-hand references, similar to someone saying they heard a rumor about a man who lived long before their time. That is thin evidence for a movement built around a supposedly world-altering life. And this absence is striking for another reason. Rome documented everything. They kept records of executions, uprisings, strange political movements, and even unusual religious trends in small villages. If a man gained disciples, performed miracles in front of crowds, marched into Jerusalem on a donkey while people shouted, and caused enough alarm to be publicly executed, Rome would have written something. But Rome did not. Not a single contemporary Roman historian mentions him. Not a governor, not a philosopher, not a merchant writing in a diary. The silence is total. And silence forces a difficult question. If a figure this transformative left almost no trace in the world where he supposedly lived, then who were early Christians actually worshiping? A historical man? A spiritual symbol? A story shaped over time? The farther you look outside Scripture, the more the historical Jesus fades, and that absence becomes impossible to ignore. Christianity looks like a remix. When you step back from the familiar story and look at the ancient world around it, something becomes unmistakable. Christianity did not appear fully formed. It did not drop from the sky complete and original. It looks assembled, piece by piece, from ideas already circulating for centuries. Take the virgin birth. Many cultures had divine heroes born from untouched mothers. It was a poetic way of saying a child came from heaven, rather than from human imperfection. The story was not new. It was recognizable. The idea of a dying and rising God was also not unique. Older religions told stories of deities who descended into the underworld, suffered, died, then returned to life as symbols of renewal. These myths were known across the Mediterranean long before anyone heard the name Jesus. The pattern was already there. Even the ritual of eating bread and wine as symbols of a god's body and blood existed long before the Last Supper. Ancient mystery cults practiced communal meals meant to unite believers with a divine figure. The symbolism of consuming sacred food was part of spiritual life across the region. This is not about accusing anyone of plagiarism. Cultures do not steal in the way individuals do. They evolve, they absorb, they reshape what already exists. A new religion often succeeds because it feels both familiar and fresh at the same time. Christianity fit into this pattern almost perfectly, and the remix continued beyond theology. As the movement grew, it absorbed political ideas, philosophical concepts, and cultural customs from Jewish communities, Greek thinkers, and Roman society. The more it expanded, the more it adapted. This is the part many people never consider. The religion we know today was not created in a single moment. It was built through centuries of mixing, borrowing, and reinterpreting the ideas people already understood. And the next transformation would not be spiritual, it would be political. And that is when everything changed. Constantine's convenience. Something dramatic happened when Christianity crossed paths with Roman power. A small, diverse, often conflicting movement suddenly turned into an imperial project. The shift was not spiritual. It was strategic. Rome had been struggling with division, corruption, and internal chaos. Constantine needed unity. He needed a glue strong enough to bind a fractured empire, and Christianity offered exactly that. People often imagine his conversion as a moment of divine awakening, a light in the sky, a holy vision. But the timing tells a different story. Christianity was already growing in influence. Its leaders were organized, its communities were disciplined, and most importantly, it offered loyalty that rose above regional identity. For an emperor balancing instability, that was priceless. Once Christianity became useful, everything accelerated. The religion that had been persecuted became protected. The faith that had been scattered became centralized. And with Roman backing, it transformed into something new. Suddenly, deciding what counted as truth was not in the hands of local teachers or small congregations. It was dictated by councils sponsored by an emperor who wanted uniformity. Books that did not fit the new narrative were banned. Teachings once considered legitimate were declared heresy. Entire gospels vanished from public life because they complicated the simple, unified story Rome preferred. What survived was not a perfect record of beliefs. It was the selection that matched imperial goals. This is the moment when Christianity, as most people know it today, was shaped. Not in the dusty roads of Jerusalem, not by fishermen or wandering preachers. By emperors, advisors, and political strategists who understood that a controlled religion could stabilize an empire. And the irony is unavoidable. Once Rome chose its official version, the story did not freeze in place. The text kept evolving. The edits continued. The debates continued. The power struggles continued. Even with an empire behind it, Christianity did not stop changing. It simply changed in a different direction. The Bible was edited a lot. Before printing presses, before mass production of books, before anything resembling modern publishing existed, every copy of the Bible was written by hand, line by line, word by word. And human hands do not produce identical results. They revise, they adjust, they interpret, they correct what they think is wrong, and sometimes they correct what was never wrong in the first place. Scribes were not just copying, they were participating. Every manuscript carries tiny fingerprints of the person who made it. Some changed small phrases because they wanted the wording to sound smoother. Others changed theology itself because they believed their version was truer than the one in front of them. Sometimes entire verses were added to support a growing doctrine. Other times, uncomfortable ideas disappeared quietly between generations of copying. This was not rare, it was normal. For centuries, it was the expected part of the process. A scribe who noticed a contradiction might adjust it. A scribe who favored one theological position might strengthen it, and a scribe who believed Jesus must have said more than what was written might simply add what he felt belonged there. Scholars today compare the oldest manuscripts and find thousands of differences. Not a handful, not a few spelling mistakes, thousands of variations. Some are small, others shift the meaning of entire scenes. And the oldest manuscripts we possess are still far removed from whatever the originals looked like. One scholar tried to summarize this problem in a single sentence. We do not know what the original Bible said, we only know what survived. It is a haunting thought, A text believed to be perfect was never stable. It was not fixed. It was evolving from the moment it was written. The more evidence we uncover, the more clearly we see how many hands have shaped the Bible, how many voices, how many choices. And one detail hidden inside this mountain of edits reveals the entire puzzle. Christianity was backfilled. Most people imagine the story unfolding in a straight line. First, an event happens, then eyewitnesses talk about it, then followers spread the message. Finally, written accounts appear. That is how history normally works. But Christianity does not follow this pattern. It moves in the opposite direction. Believers came first. Written stories came later. And eyewitnesses were added only after the stories needed them. The earliest Christian writings speak about a spiritual figure revealed through visions and scriptures, not through physical encounters. There is no mention of a birth in Bethlehem, no shepherds, no miracles, no trial under Pilate. Those elements appear decades later, once communities begin shaping a narrative that feels complete. What happened next is something historians call retrofitting. Prophecies from older Jewish texts were reinterpreted to match the growing story. If a verse hinted that the Messiah would come from a certain place, the narrative was adjusted to match it. If an ancient poem spoke of suffering, the gospel writers wove that image into the crucifixion. It was not the prophecy predicting the story. It was the story being crafted to fit the prophecy. Events were rewritten to appear fulfilled. Details were rearranged to create symbolic meaning. Entire scenes were shaped around scriptures that predated Jesus by centuries. The direction was clear. The religion shaped the history, not the other way around. Once you realize this, the puzzle pieces fall into place. The contradictions make sense. The silence in earlier sources makes sense. The sudden appearance of elaborate stories many decades later makes sense. You are watching belief carving out its own past. And there is one final shift that brings everything into focus. The movement did not just invent a past to strengthen its message. It tapped into something deeply psychological. Something that explains why people accepted the story so quickly and defended it so fiercely. And that brings us to the deepest layer of all. People don't believe Christianity because of history. Here is the part that people rarely say out loud. The strength of Christianity was never built on historical certainty. It was built on emotional power. This is the uncomfortable truth. Most believers do not cling to the faith because the evidence is overwhelming. They cling to it because the story answers deep human fears. It offers comfort in places where life feels frightening and unpredictable. Think about what the religion promises. A cosmic father who watches over every moment. A divine plan that transforms suffering into purpose. A world where justice is guaranteed, not hoped for. A place after death where pain dissolves and existence becomes eternal. These ideas soothe the parts of the mind that struggle with loss, randomness, and fear. When the historical foundation is weak, emotion fills the space. And emotion can feel more real than any document or archaeological discovery. This is why questioning the history feels threatening to many believers. It is not just about facts. It is about safety, stability, identity. Removing the story feels like removing the ground beneath their feet. But this is the turning point for anyone who steps back. Once you separate the emotional comfort from the historical claims, something shifts. You begin to see the story differently. Not as a record carved by eyewitnesses, but as a narrative shaped by generations of believers. A construction built to protect people from the uncertainties of life. And this realization does not make anything meaningless. It simply reveals what was always happening beneath the surface. Faith was built first on emotion, then on story, and only later wrapped in the language of history. Once you see that, one final thought naturally follows. If the comfort is real but the history is not, then you have the freedom to search for truth outside the story. And that freedom changes everything. History isn't the enemy, it's the escape. When people say Christianity has a history problem, the instinct is to feel threatened, as if exposing the cracks in the story destroys something sacred. But history is not the enemy. It is the doorway out of confusion. It is the path out of inherited belief and into something clearer, something grounded, something actually your own. Once you stop needing the story to be literally true, the world opens. You can ask questions without fear. You can study origins without guilt. You can trace ideas back through older cultures, and see how myths evolved from one generation to the next. Instead of defending a narrative, you explore it. Instead of repeating what you were taught, you investigate what actually happened. And the questions become more interesting. What real events inspired these ancient stories? Which teachings came from human wisdom, not divine intervention? Why were people drawn to these beliefs, and what were they trying to solve in their own lives? When you remove the supernatural lens, the picture becomes richer, not smaller. You begin to see human creativity, human fear, human hope, and human longing woven through every verse. History does not shrink the meaning, it clarifies it. You learn that myth-making was a way for people to cope with suffering, that rituals were used to create unity, that stories offered comfort in a world that felt brutal and unpredictable. These insights do not destroy the emotional power of the story, they explain it. And something liberating happens the moment you stop defending the myth. You begin to understand yourself, your own fears, your own patterns of belief, your own need for meaning and stability. You no longer rely on inherited explanations, you build your own. That clarity feels different. It is steady. It does not require faith. It does not break when questioned. And for many people, that sense of grounded truth is worth more than any imagined reward in the afterlife. Because once you step out of the story, you realize something simple. The world is still full of wonder. You did not lose anything. You gained the freedom to see reality without fear. So where does this leave us? Not angry, not cynical, just honest. Christianity stands not on historical certainty, but on layers of stories built over centuries. Stories shaped by fear, politics, power, and hope. And once you see how fragile those foundations are, you understand something liberating. If the story was constructed, you can deconstruct it. If it was inherited, you can release it. If it was imposed, you can walk away. History doesn't destroy meaning. It clears the fog so you can create your own. If this video helped you see the past more clearly, or question what you were taught, subscribe. Because here, we don't worship stories. We uncover them, one truth at a time.